Thank you very much for that. And welcome everybody to our webinar today, wherever you are joining us today for this webinar. I really want to thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to join us at this time for this webinar. I am David Matsumoto, and I'm honored and humbled that you have decided to spend your time and share your time with us today. I hope you'll find that the material is fun and interesting and perhaps meaningful to all of you in your life in some way, shape, or form. I'm planning to spend the next maybe 45 minutes or so introducing some of the basics of social influence that we know from science. And then hopefully we'll leave some time for some questions and hopefully answers for the last 10 minutes or so. So give me a second and we'll get started. Okay, everybody. Once again, thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the basics of social influence. Here is the outline that I'll be talking through today, as well as the goals. And I'd like to start with the goals, okay? My goal is to provide all of us with an introduction to various evidence-based topics of social influence. And when I say evidence-based, all of these topics that I've selected for us today are those that have been studied in social sciences, especially in social psychology, and that we know that have been documented and verified through applied research about the various natures of social influence. And the studies that have been done over the last many decades on these topics basically fall into these buckets. And so you can see on the left side, there's the buckets that form the outline of what we'll be talking about today. It's conformity, compliance, and obedience. And then we'll move on to cooperation. And then we'll talk about emotion contagion. We'll talk about the dual concepts of social loafing and social striving. Then talk a little bit about leadership. And then finally, we'll end up with persuasion and influence. And once again, I want to reiterate, these are topics that I've selected from the social science literature because they form the basics of social influence as we know it today. And so I'll be trying to let you know who are some of the leading authors or some of the classic and seminal researchers that produced the original research that formed the basis for many of these topics. Okay, and so hopefully it'll be interesting like that. I won't delve too deeply into some or many of the studies except a few here because they're kind of interesting. But hopefully we'll get an idea again of the evidence-based topics of social influence that exists. And we'll start with the topic of conformity, compliance, and obedience. Now, in social science and social psychology, these topics, conformity, compliance, and obedience, are generally considered together within the larger rubric of social influence. And I want to start with the message on the left here. These are important constructs, just like the others. They're all important constructs in any social system as ways of reinforcing behaviors. So even though if we just talk about the words like conformity, compliance, and obedience out of context, they often, not always, often have some kind of negative connotations. But in reality, these are concepts that are important to any group, to any society, as ways of reinforcing behaviors, okay? And so they can be positive or negative. They can have both positive and negative types of outcomes. They're just ways in which these kinds of, the social system exists. And here are some definitions for us that we can take away. Conformity is generally thought to be yielding to real or imagined social pressure. Compliance, which is very, very similar, right? It's yielding to social pressure in one's public behavior, even though one's private beliefs may not have changed. So there's a lot of overlap between conformity and compliance. Obedience, which is related, but somewhat different, right? It's a form of compliance that occurs when people follow direct commands. So in obedience, there's a direct command to comply to. And so when there's a compliance to a direct command, it's called obedience, right? And usually those commands are coming from someone of perceived authority. So in this area of psychology, there are a few studies that form the backbone of what we know about compliance, conformity, compliance, and obedience. And I want to introduce everybody to what is known as the Asch experiments. This is a researcher named Solomon Asch conducted these very, very well-known sets of experiments. And let me describe one a little bit so that we get the idea of what happened, okay? And this is one of many. So Asch conducted one of many different variations of this experiment. But in the most famous one, what he did was he created an experiment where a participant went into a room with 7 Confederates, and Confederates are people who are part of the experimental team. Okay, so the participant is actually going into a room with 7 Confederates, but the participant doesn't know that. The participant is thinking that these are other participants like he or she is. Okay, and they're given these lines like this that you can see on the right-hand side. There's a target line, and then there's these other lines on the right, A, B, and C. And every person in the room is asked which line on the right-hand side matches the target line on the left. And if you can see it, there's obviously a correct answer and an incorrect answer, right? And again, Asch has done this in many different ways where the participant is either number 1 or number 2 or number 3. And it turns out that when the participant is the last to answer, and you've got 7 people in front of you, and if all 7 say an incorrect answer, it turns out that you, the participant, will increase the likelihood that you will pick the clearly incorrect answer. So as you can see on the left-hand side, on average, 32% conform to the incorrect answer. When in reality, when there's no such constraints on the individuals in a control group, less than 1%, I mean, almost nobody conforms, right? Because the answer is so clear. And then over multiple trials, if you do this more and more times, what's really interesting is that 75% of the people conform at least once. So this experiment and variations of this experiment led to this thinking that, wow, people, just the fact that other people are doing something can help change somebody to give a completely incorrect answer. And so these were the Asch experiments, and this was some of the first very classic studies about conformity and compliance that are in the field. Another very famous experiment is known as the Milgram experiment, and many people have heard about the Milgram experiment. Like the Asch experiment, there are various variations, okay? But let me tell you about the most famous one. In the original one, there's 40 men who are recruited to come to a laboratory that you can see, like on the right-hand side there. There's these big, and this is 40, 50 years ago, so these big, ominous-looking equipment with these dials and knobs and whatnot. And there's a label that says this is a shock generator. Okay, and by the way, this experiment could not be conducted today given the rules of ethics that exist for conducting research. But back in the day, 60 years ago or so, or 70 years ago, this experiment was conducted. So a participant is coming in, you're seeing these kind of equipment, the shock generator has got switches that are labeled with slight shock, moderate shock, danger, severe shock. And the participant is told that they're the teacher who's going to deliver a shock to the student in a neighboring room. Now they can't see the student, but they're in another room. And the teacher is asking the student question. And the student, of course, is a Confederate. They're part of the research team, and they're not actually hooked up to anything. They're just in the other room. And so participants are believing that they're delivering real shocks to the Confederate student. And of course, they're asking questions, and the Confederate student is answering incorrectly. And so the experimenter who's in the room right next to the participant now tells the participant, okay, you got to shock them with by pulling the switch. And they start with the lowest, and they're moving up and moving up and moving up. And at some point, the Confederate student on the other side starts to bang on the wall and starts to yell, and then but the researcher is still urging the participant to continue. So the participant continues to deliver shocks, and then at some point, the participant in the Confederate in the other room just becomes silent, which is crazy, right? Many participants at that point are asking the experimenter whether they should continue, and the experimenter just says things like, please continue, or the experiment requires that you continue, or it's absolutely essential that you continue, et cetera, et cetera. And obedience was measured by the level of shock that the participant was willing to deliver. And of course, many people are becoming agitated, right? Because you don't want to keep doing that. However, 65% of the people still delivered the maximum shocks. It's just quite an amazing finding, right? And of the 40 participants in the study, 26 delivered the maximum shocks, and then 14 stopped before reaching the highest levels. And that's an amazing amount of conformity, to tell you the truth, in that situation. Again, this is one of the classic studies in psychology. Milgram created different variations of it. And as I mentioned before, luckily, this kind of study could not be done today. But there's other variations of the study that don't have those kinds of effects on participants. And so jumping to today, there's actually been many studies that have replicated or tried, again, the ASH study in many different countries. And what all those studies, Bond and Smith actually did a meta-analysis, which is an analysis of many other studies that demonstrated that conformity actually occurs all around the world. I mean, again, remember, the ASH study is where people are giving a very obviously incorrect answer, right? And still levels of conformity are occurring. The mean conformity rate was 25% across all the studies, but still, and then some countries have higher rates of conformity and some have lowers. But still, the level of conformity exists. Again, this is to obviously incorrect answers, right? So it's kind of an amazing kind of phenomenon that occurs all around the world. Bond and Smith, in their meta-analysis, actually also reviewed studies on the Milgram that tried to redo the Milgram paradigm, and they also found that the amount of conformity and compliance existed, all around the world. It goes from a low of 16% to a high of 92% in one of the countries studied. Now, both in the ASH studies and the Milgram studies, there's a range of conformity that's occurring. They may reflect cultural differences. They may reflect something about the tasks. The takeaway I get from it is that, wow, this stuff as a phenomenon exists basically universally, right? I mean, there's higher percentages and lower percentages in different countries and cultures and whatnot. Those could be due to cultures or the individuals or the way the meaning of the experiment or whatever. But as a universal human phenomenon, conformity and compliance exists. And so I think that's the message I take away from this type of literature. Moving on, the next topic that we're going to discuss is cooperation. Cooperation, of course, is something that is very, very important to all of us. It refers to people's ability to work together towards common goals, right? And cooperation is really interesting because, of course, cooperation is necessary in every society, and it's based on unique cognitive abilities, and especially this concept called shared intentionality. And I don't have the time, and I don't want to take the time today to talk a lot about shared intentionality, but I happen to believe that shared intentionality is at the root of human cultures and the development and the maintenance of human cultures. And I believe the main purpose and function of human communication, including language and nonverbal behavior, is to share intentions. But anyway, because we have those abilities to share intentions through language and other communicative abilities, we can cooperate. And of course, if we can cooperate, this is of great importance in every group, in every community, in every society and culture, in every family, right? So cooperation is a universal phenomenon that is part of the basics of social influence. Cooperation has been studied extensively in social psychology. But here's an interesting thing, there's some research studies that have suggested that there are cultural differences in cooperation. And you'll find some research that suggests that people in collectivistic societies, like many countries around the world, right? East Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin and South America, et cetera, there tend to be more collectivistic in their cultural orientation than more individualistic cultures like United States, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, et cetera. And so there's been studies that have demonstrated that the rates of cooperation tend to be higher in collectivistic societies than compared to individualistic societies. While of course cooperation exists everywhere, right? We're talking about relative differences. What's also interesting is that there's individual differences, right? Because there's people who are just generally more trusting than others. And then, so if you can think of an individual difference, like people who are high trusters versus people who are low trusters, right? People who are high trusters tend to be more cooperating than people who are low trusters. So there are individual differences in all of this as well. I say all of this to point to these interesting sets of studies that a researcher named Yamagishi did. Yamagishi did these studies from the late 80s throughout his career in the mid 2000s and 2010s, where he showed that while those differences existed on cooperation, they're existing essentially because of the sanctioning systems that exist in different cultures and societies. So every culture and society has a different punishment system to encourage or discourage certain types of behavior, right? And cooperation is one of those types of behaviors. And I'll try to synthesize Yamagishi's findings, but essentially what he showed across a number of studies over 10 or 15 years was that you can take two cultures, let's say the United States and Japan, and show that on any kind of task, yes, you'll find that the Japanese cooperate more than the Americans. And then there's the stereotypic interpretation that the Japanese are more collectivistic and the Americans are not, and thus the collectivism drives the cooperation. But in reality, if you set the sanctioning system or the punishment system for certain types of behaviors to be the same in both countries, what you get is no differences in the amount of cooperation. And he's demonstrated that in a number of studies with different countries. And so what it turns out to be is that differences, what appears to be differences, which is why there's a question mark there, what appears to be differences in cooperation may simply be a function of whatever sanctioning systems or punishment systems that are in force around us, And this kind of thought or this kind of finding has amazing implications even to societies today, right? If we think of the sanctioning systems that we put in place for all kinds of behaviors, whether it's good behaviors or bad behaviors, it's this set of studies points to the fact that, or the thought that those sanctioning systems are really what's important in facilitating cooperation or not, or curbing bad behavior or not. And so that's why I wanted to point out this interesting set of studies that Yamagishi did. So cooperation is clearly a universal phenomenon. Without cooperation, no society or group or culture would survive. And when there's differences in that levels of cooperation, they're probably related to some differences in the sanctioning systems or the punishment systems or the encouragement systems, benefit systems that the group has adopted. One interesting finding in the field, in this area of research, is that when people from different cultures come together, we call that intercultural interactions, right? When people from different cultures come together, they generally cooperate less. The data are just kind of like relative to intracultural or people of the same cultures interacting. When people of different cultures come together, they interact less cooperatively and more competitively, okay, which is an interesting phenomenon out there. And years ago, we did this research, if you can see on the left side, that linked those differences in intercultural interactions to differences in the cultures from which the people are coming from. And what it turned out to be was that when there's a large difference in what's known as power distance, like some cultures are very high on power distance and some cultures are very low on power distance. Power distance refers to the degree to which a culture facilitates differences in status and power and hierarchy, whereas others are more egalitarian, right? When people of different cultures on power distance, for like a person from a very high power distance culture interacting with a person from a very egalitarian culture, when they interact, they happen to cooperate less and compete more, which is, again, it's an interesting phenomenon. And we demonstrated that that phenomenon is related to power distance. In a second study, we then examined the types of emotions that were associated with the players in those studies. And what you find was that those differences had to do with the amount of contempt the players were feeling in those studies at the time the study started. And they may or may not have realized that they were feeling that, but the data reduced to the fact that they were, to the degree to which they were feeling contemptuous, which is kind of an interesting thing, right? Because contempt is an emotion of moral superiority, something about hierarchy, which is related to power distance. And thus, those kinds of emotional differences may have set people off to be less cooperative and more competitive, which kind of makes sense, right? And thus, it takes a little bit more work in order to become cooperative and competitive, and more cooperative and less competitive. So I wanted to let all of you know about this interesting line of research within the cooperation bucket of research that exists in social psychology. Okay, here's another interesting topic within social psychology on social influences. It has to do with emotion contagion. And again, I'm trying to give credit where credit is due. This concept of emotion contagion started with researcher Elaine Hatfield and others in 1993, and then has flourished until now. Now, what is emotion contagion? It is exactly as it sounds. Emotion contagion is a phenomenon where when someone's emotions lead to or produce similar emotions in others. So it's sort of like yawning. As you know, yawning is very contagious, right? And even as I'm talking and I see this picture, I have to kind of try not to yawn. Maybe some of you who are looking at this started thinking about yawning as well. So just as yawning is contagious, emotions are contagious as well. And what Hatfield and colleagues have demonstrated over the years is that when there's a group of people, one person or several persons' emotions can affect the rest of the emotions of the rest of the people, which is a very interesting phenomenon, right? And this is called emotion contagion. Now, why does it occur? To tell you the truth, science has not gotten to the point where we know exactly why emotion contagion occurs. I think, and I'm being speculative here right now because I'm not an expert in yawning, although I do it a lot. But I think scientists in that area have not pinned down the mechanism by which yawning is contagious either. I think that's true as well. But there's an interesting line of research within the emotion contagion literature that has to do with what's called mirror neurons. And a team of researchers, I think they were originally neuropsychologists in Italy, demonstrated that in the human brain includes these neurons that allow our faces to mimic faces that we're perceiving. So that's really an interesting thing, right? That you can see a face and certain neurons in our heads will light up and activate to produce some degree of mimicry in our faces. So that's a really interesting phenomenon, right? That could start to explain emotion contagion. So if we see a face, we may have an automatic unconscious process to start putting that face on, or at least fire the neural system, the neural circuitry underlying that face in ourselves. Separately from that, there's a large literature on what's known as facial feedback. And facial feedback is a concept that suggests that when we have an expression on our faces, the fact that we've got it on our faces tells our brains we're having that emotion, and thus turns on our emotional system inside of us. So separately from the mirror neuron research literature is a facial feedback research literature. And that's, again, that says that once we have that on our faces are feeding back to our brains that turns on the rest of our bodies. And that's why, for example, sometimes people can just put on a face, even though they're not feeling an emotion, they can put on a face and start to feel that emotion. And so, and that's an interesting phenomenon that has been documented in many studies as well. Not everybody, it doesn't occur with everybody, but occurs with a large proportion of individuals. So if we put that together, right, if we've got mirror neurons that are firing our faces in a way that we see others' faces, and if facial feedback actually is a concept that occurs, what that's saying is that when we see somebody else's face, our brains are firing in a way that will turn on our faces, and that will feed back to us to have that emotion to some degree, right? To some degree, which may then start to explain why emotion contagion occurs. If that's the case, that would be an interesting thing that would be an interesting basis for human empathy, human communication, human compassion. I think those links, the links that I just told you exist. I think they can be thought of as coming together to form this basis of empathy and communication and compassion. As I mentioned earlier, the links are not that clear yet in terms of scientific evidence, but I do believe that they'll be put together like that someday. I also wanted to mention, as many of you know, I spend a lot of time training people on how to read facial expressions of emotion, and especially microexpressions. And microexpressions are really interesting, right? Because this happens inevitably in most of my classes. Because when we're training to see microexpressions, people are seeing them when they're presented very quickly at 100 milliseconds, right? This is a 1/10 of a second. And when people are beginning to be trained, they don't recognize the face. Many of them don't recognize the faces immediately. Some do, but many of them don't. And for those who are working on learning to label what they saw, I often perceive their faces actually doing the face that they saw in a 1/10 of a second as they're trying to figure out what the label is. So this is really interesting to me, because whenever I'm in a class teaching people to see microexpressions, and I've got the microexpressions at a speed of a 1/10 of a second, people are seeing it. And even though it was only presented for a 1/10 of a second, and even though the individual may not be able to label what it is, I see their faces doing it. And so now I'm coming back to this slide. That seems to me that the mirror neurons and the mimicry mechanisms does exist. And if that's true, that's turning on some facial feedback. And that is the basis for empathy and compassion and communication, regardless of whether we have the ability to label it. Because the ability to label something is a verbal ability that requires higher cognitive skills and language, et cetera, et cetera. And what we might be talking here on an emotion contagion issue is something that is less higher in cognition, right? It's something that is more elemental in part of our neural composition. So I wanted to mention my experience when training individuals to see micros, because I see this all the time. Every class that I have, I'll see individuals who are struggling to find a label. And sometimes they even give the wrong label, an incorrect label, but their faces are doing exactly what the 1/10 of a second expression was. So anyway, I wanted to mention that because that's kind of interesting. So let's move on to some other concepts within the social influence literature in social psychology. And the next two are social loafing and social striving. There's really interesting to me. Social loafing, when people are in a group and they've got a task to do, right? And we're all in groups that have tasks to do. Sometimes individual productivity, individual motivation, it tends to reduce when we're in groups. So that then leads to the outcome that the product of the group is less than the sum of individual members. I mean, you can measure this, right? You can get individuals to do certain things, and you can count up, for example, count up the number of things they did, and you put them in the group, and the group has to do the same amount of things. If the group is producing less, then there's some degree of social loafing occurring, right? Because somehow individual productivity and motivation is being reduced. And this has led to the concept of free riders, right? People who are in a group or members of a group who are not producing as much as others and just kind of riding freely with whatever the group is producing. They're called free riders. And so this is a concept called social loafing. It's a very interesting concept in group psychology. On the other hand, there's the opposite effect, right? It's called social striving. So sometimes some groups, working in a group enhances individual performance rather than diminishes it. So then the product of the group is greater than the sum of the individual members. So again, if you can find a task where individuals can do it and just count up the number of times they do, like 10 people do the task, and you can sum that up, that's what each individual member can do. If you put them in a group and they do even more than the sum of the individuals, then that means that the group is enhancing individual performance, right? Somehow the interaction of the members are producing something that the individuals themselves didn't have. And that's the concept called social striving. While the mechanisms that lead to either social loafing or social striving are not yet clear. I mean, there's a lot of research that have suggested what some of those are, like social sanctioning systems, right? What kind of sanctioning systems are in place to ensure performance, et cetera, et cetera. One factor that has been shown to influence whether members of a group either loaf or strive is leadership. And leadership is a big area of research in the social influence domain in psychology. So leadership is really interesting. All leaders, as you know, everybody knows, all leaders face certain issues, right? Especially when you got to get things done. I mean, and essentially research has kind of put the issues that leaders face into these two buckets. It's task performance, right? We got to get things done, sometimes versus group maintenance. Sometimes it's relationship maintenance, right? So leaders face this dilemma to either forget the unity of the group, forget about how well the group exists with each other or think about each other, just focus on the task, or sacrifice the performance of the task and maintain unity of the group where the group feels better about it themselves, right? So it turns out leaders have to juggle these two issues, among other issues, but these two very important issues with any kind of group. And they have to deal with motivation to do the job while keeping the group together while they're herding cats, because we're all different. Thank goodness for the individual differences that we all have out there. So there's been extensive studies about the characteristics of leaders that are universally endorsed all around the world. There are many researchers, but probably the most influential set of researchers are a consortium of researchers known as the GLOBE Project. And the GLOBE Project has produced a number of amazing findings over the years. And they have suggested that some of the characteristics of leaders that are universally endorsed as good leaders, right, effective leaders, are charisma, which is a really tough concept to define, right? Charisma is the ability to connect and persuade other individuals to do something. Well, at the same time, team orientation, right? The focus on the team as a whole. And then and also an interesting finding in the research literature is that across all countries studied, leaders perceived as expressing empathy are rated as better performers. So this is a really interesting thing as well. It's charisma, team orientation, and the degree to which one is perceived as being empathetic. So I wanted to mention that I think these are really interesting social influence factors when we're in groups, especially as leaders. So moving on, I wanted to go to this topic, which is persuasion and influence, even though we've been talking about these topics, persuasion and influence, throughout the entire few minutes that we've had together. I wanted to separate out this label, persuasion and influence, because it is also its own, it has become its own bucket in social psychology on its own by itself. And probably, or without a doubt, the most influential psychologist in this area is Robert Cialdini. Cialdini has written a number of books over the last few decades called the Psychological Principles Underlying Persuasion, Influence, and Compliance. He started with 6 and has written about a 7th, and that's why you see on my slide, I've got 6 parentheses 7. The 6 that you see on the left-hand side of the white screen, reciprocity, consistency, social proof, liking, authority, and scarcity, were the original 6 that Cialdini had written about. He has of late written also of a 7th principle called unity, okay? And what Cialdini has done is that he's done an amazing job of corralling and integrating and synthesizing not only his amazing studies, but also the entire social psychological literature, right? Because, for example, the concept of social proof that he talks about is also related to conformity, which we talked about earlier. Liking, which he talks about, is also related to cooperation, which we talked about earlier. Authority, which that he talks about, is also related to obedience, which we talked about earlier. So my point is, Cialdini has done an amazing amount of research himself, but also has done a great job of integrating the fields, the knowledge in the field, to come up with these various principles of persuasion and influence. One of the points that Cialdini makes, which is absolutely true in my opinion, is that these principles are not new, right? Because these principles exist because societies and cultures and groups, all groups, need them. Because we're always working with each other and living with each other, we need to be able to influence each other in certain ways anyway. And so we all do these principles. What Cialdini has done is he's done an amazing job of extracting them and providing labels for them so that we can understand them. But we all do this on an unconscious or perhaps conscious way, manner in our everyday lives. Also, interestingly, I wanted to mention that they all work. All of the influences, the factors of persuasion and influence work because they mobilize emotion, right? They're creating an emotion either through what's known as cognitive dissonance or anxiety or something that motivates people to do something to alleviate their emotion. Really, basically, that's what it is. The things happen, it creates this kind of ambivalence or a cognitive dissonance or some kind of emotion in us, and we do something in return to alleviate our emotion. So there's an emotional component that's at the core of all of these social influence principles. So I thought I'd spend time talking about one example of Cialdini and its reciprocity because it's very easy to understand. What he suggests, which is absolutely true, it's true in everyday society and cultures, that we all learn to reciprocate. Because when we receive something, we feel an obligation to give something back, right? Receiving something creates an obligation to give something back, and it's future-oriented. That by receiving something, it triggers an indebtedness. And Cialdini and others talk about the web of indebtedness, right? We get into this feeling of being indebted, and we're obligated to pay back somehow. And as we all know, there's many cultures and societies and parts of many cultures and societies that have rituals about gift giving, right? That kind of what do I want to say? Reify this principle. And most of us find it disagreeable to be, in this state of obligation. We want to do something so that we can do something about our feelings of disagreeableness, basically. And we also know people who violate the reciprocity rule by just getting and never giving back. And so then they become kind of social outcasts, right? So given this principle, that's a universal principle for all societies to survive, and that we all learn, given this principle, Cialdini suggests that here's some ways in which we can influence others, right? We can give something, whether it's a gift or provide a service or do a favor, or we can make a concession to something. If we concede, we're giving in, right? We're giving in. So making a concession is a way of giving, or providing an additional incentive is a way of giving. So Cialdini has done, again, he's done a great job of corralling not only the principles, right, but finding concrete ways that we can do things to affect others, to influence others, so that we can get something as well. Again, not necessarily for a material motive, but these are principles that are just embedded in society and embedded in our minds. Cialdini also suggests that there are some things that amplify these effects, right? So when we give something, the more meaningful it is, the better, right? The more customized it is for that person, that specific person, the better. And the more unexpected it is, that's better. So I wanted to give you an example of how Cialdini kind of positions this one principle, and has specific suggestions for things that we can do to influence others and persuade others to do things. I do want to mention that many of you know that we do have a workshop called Tactical Social Influence. And in our Tactical Social Influence, we of course introduce these and other principles and other aspects of social psychology that I mentioned earlier today. But we do go well beyond these suggestions, right? And we find ways in our training workshops, we find ways for participants to develop and deliver strategies and tactics related to all the various principles of persuasion and influence that are not apparent. And this is one of the cool things I think that occurs in our in-person workshops on tactical social influence. So I just wanted to mention that and give us a little plug here at this time. Okay, so I'm moving on to a quick conclusion here. There are actually many other social influence constructs that have been demonstrated and documented in science. And as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to give us a flavor of what all the different types of buckets or constructs that have been documented in science that exist, that have something to do with social influence, how we influence and are influenced by others. And so here's some other constructs, or like there's something out there called the mere exposure effect. Trust and trustworthiness, of course, are very important concepts with regard to social influence. And of course, rapport is another very important one as well. And so I wanted to acknowledge that there are other constructs as well. And finally, before we end up my portion of this webinar, I did wanted to mention and revisit this important topic of, why do all of these things exist, right? And here's the way I understand all of this. And it starts with the fact that we live in group life. We live as groups, as members of groups. From the beginning of human existence, humans are living in groups, right? At some point in time, we figured out, hopefully, that living in groups was better for our survival than living as individuals, independent individuals. We could do a lot of things by living in a group. Like we can, division of labor is one thing, right? Instead of one person having to do everything, this group of people could do something, this group of people could do something else, that group of people could do something else, and we could then come together and share in the common good by dividing our labors. And so that's one big deal, one big benefit of living as groups. There are others, right? However, the fact that we live in groups produces social complexity because individuals are different, right? It's like that herding cats slide that I had earlier. And again, thank goodness we're all different. we need those individual differences. But the fact that we have those individual differences while we live in groups produces social complexity. The fact that we have social complexity thus produces a need for social coordination. We need to be coordinated somehow, right? We need to increase coordination, reduce chaos. In order for the group to survive, this is what we need to do. We need to increase coordination and decrease chaos. Culture, every culture around the world, every culture in every group, in every organization, in every community, right? Because cultures exist on many different levels. Cultures create rules and ways to increase social coordination and decrease social chaos. It implements those rules, those norms, those beliefs, those attitudes through these methods of social influence. The methods of social influence are tools that every group uses to produce behaviors that increase social coordination and reduce social chaos so that we can go back and survive. If we didn't have these methods of social influence, we would have more chaos and less coordination, and groups wouldn't survive. And so it's very clear to me that methods of social influence are these tools or these techniques that every culture has in order to help every group to survive. And I wanted to give that to everybody to have a larger framework as to why all of this is occurring, because they're very important in every group and every culture. And with that, I hope that everybody has that I've been able to not persuade, but provide an introduction to the various kinds of social influences that social psychological research has documented over the years, and that we live in everyday lives. I hope that we've been able to expand our horizons and our knowledge base about that. And with that, I will turn the floor back to our hostess and see if there are any questions that exist that we can answer in the next 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Just as a reminder, if you have a question, please put it into the Q&A. There are several questions that have been submitted already, and we'll start with one of them, which is, what is one tip that you can give us on how we can be better influencers over others?
Oh, well, thank you very much for the question. And I think it's a really appropriate question because, as you can see, I tried to give basically an introduction to research in this area and the various buckets that the research falls in. And so it's more academic. Well, I tried to make it not as academic, but I wanted to give everybody a flavor of the science that exists. But practically speaking, I mean, there's a lot of ways of doing that. But if I had to give one tip, it would be something like find a way to be pleasant. Being pleasant, coming off as being pleasant and feeling it, being genuinely pleasant and courteous and kind to others generally allows others will be more likely to do something for us, right? And especially if we're coming in for giving a request, or we got something to ask, or if we want somebody else to do it, it's easier for others to say yes if we are pleasant when we're asking, and if we're courteous when we're asking. And so the one tip I would have is, whenever we are going to do that, try to be pleasant and courteous. And it's probably a good tip to try to have as much as we can. I think that it's setting the tone for many of our interactions. It's a good way to set the tone for many of our interactions.
Thank you for that tip. We have several other questions. Not sure if we're going to be able to get to all of them.
Okay.
But this person asks, relative to cooperation being influenced by sanctions, if there are sanctions on behavior, does this not change the behavior from cooperation to compliance? Is there a difference between cooperation and compliance with regards to behavior?
Yes. So I apologize that I was mentioning the sanctioning system in relation to punishments for punishments when I was talking about cooperation. But the sanctioning system can be a system that allows for positive behavior to occur too, right? And so yes, it could reduce cooperative behavior if the sanctioning system was punishing the cooperative behavior, but if the sanctioning system was encouraging or reinforcing the cooperative behavior, then it produced more cooperative behavior. So sanctioning itself probably has the wrong connotation. I use that word because Yamagishi in the original research used that word, but it was clear in those studies, and I'm happy to put the studies available or write-ups of the studies available for us later on. It's clear even in those studies, while he called it sanctioning system, cooperative behavior in different conditions increased. And so I hope I'm doing an okay job in explaining that, but yeah, it's not necessarily that sanctioning was punishment of cooperative behavior. Sanctioning was punishments and reinforcements for different types of behavior. Hope that made sense.
We have a couple more questions.
Okay.
This one is related to leadership and group performance.
Okay.
And the question is, do you think that good leaders are aware of the tension between social loafers and social achievers and actively manage the room, or are effective leaders unconscious competents who manage this tension without knowing it?
Oh, that's a great use of that term. This is my speculation. I think it's both. I think that there are some leaders who are very effective that are not as conscious. Well, let me take it back. I think effective leaders are conscious of these tendencies, right? I think effective leaders to some degree are. I think within that, there are people who are really conscious about it and strategically, consciously manage that, and others who are conscious of it, but are unconscious of how they deal with it. It's probably something like that. I think if people are not even unconsciously, figuring that differentiation out, I think they wouldn't be as effective. I think when you're talking about effective leaders, they have some degree of awareness of the fact that those kinds of individuals and the composition of their group is existing in a certain way, and will do something about it. But that was my speculation. I don't know of research that explains how effective leaders are aware of or recognize that particular issue. So I want to be clear. That was my speculation about that.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. This person asks, do you think people tend to be persuaded in an easier way to do bad things rather than good things?
Oh, certainly there are times and contexts in which people are more easily persuaded to do bad things than good things. Before that, I was thinking about people who are just easily persuaded, right? Whether it's bad or good. And that's why we have the English word gullible, right? Because people are just easily listen to others, are easy to fall prey to scammers, et cetera, et cetera. But whether there's individual differences on the person level that will make people more easy to be falling to do bad things, I'm not exactly sure if it exists on an individual level. I think there are contexts in which people are more likely to fall into or be persuaded to do something bad. So certainly there are contexts like that. Yes, well, yes. So my answer is yes. Certainly there are contexts like that. I'm not sure whether that's in the individual or whether it's because of the push of the context, though, because I make a differentiation between the push of a context and what's in an individual as an individual characteristic. So hopefully I made sense on that one.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
And this one is relative to emotion, contagion, and facial mimicry.
Okay.
And this person asks, do you consider this to be an innate reaction like the fight or flight response and to be an important survival mechanism for our species? Or is this a reaction that can be consciously controlled, or is it automatic?
From what I understand of it, both from the research literature and my own personal observations, I think the mimicry part and the mirror neuron, the existence of mirror neurons that produces the mimicry, I think that's an innate issue. I think that's in our brains. I don't think that we learned that. I think it's different than the fight or flight thing. Now, the fight or flight thing requires a little bit more processing, I think. because the fight or flight requires the processing of it and the evaluation of a situation that will produce an emotion. That's the fight or flight. The facial mimicry is perhaps a little bit more elemental, right? Because it doesn't require that type of cognitive processing, but I do believe it's innate. So, and I forget the rest of that question, but I remember the first part of that question, whether it was innate or not. So can you remind me whether there was a second part to that question?
I think that was the question.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think we're out of time, and we thank everyone for joining our free webinar. All attendees will be receiving a follow-up email with an exclusive discount code, so please keep an eye out for that sometime today. And if you have a chance, please visit our website. Don't forget to follow us on social media, and we thank you for attending and have a great day.
Bye-bye. Thank you.